Hey guys, and welcome to episode 1 of my brand new video series titled Directed by Steven Spielberg. This series will be focused on reviewing and analysing each film by the man who I consider to be the greatest filmmaker of all time. 34 films comprise Spielberg's directorial filmography, not including his amateur debut Firelight and the Twilight Zone movie, which he only part directed, both of which I will not be covering in this series. Despite being a die-hard fan, I've only seen roughly half of the films that he's directed throughout his career, so I am very excited to 1. Discover these new films for the first time, and 2. To revisit some of my most beloved films. Each video in this series will be dedicated to a single film as I move through them chronologically. That means 34 videos from yours truly. With that said, for this first video we go all the way back to the early 70s for Spielberg's first feature film titled Duel. I hope you will all join me on this amazing adventure as we dive into the masterful mind of the great Steven Spielberg. So without further ado, let's get started. As mentioned, the film we will be discussing today is Duel, a 1971 American action thriller released initially on television before gaining a theatrical release. This marks Spielberg's first official directorial debut, not including his 1964 amateur film Firelight. Duel centers on a traveling salesman named David Mann, played by Dennis Weaver, driving his car through the rural California to meet a client. However, on the way he finds himself chased and terrorized by a mysterious driver of a truck whose face remains unseen throughout the course of the film. It's an exceedingly simple plot that revolves entirely around a highway chase throughout the Mojave Desert between a salesman and a mysterious trucker. The film is almost exclusively focused on the character of David Mann, who is being chased, constantly racking his brain for ways to escape his stalker. There's little dialogue and barely a supporting cast. This was indeed my first time watching this film, but I found it exceedingly fascinating to observe the filmmaking qualities on display that have permeated throughout Spielberg's career, including his best films. From the first frame of this film, you have a long, continuous take executed with a tracking shot shown from the perspective of a driver on the road. The long take and the tracking shot have become staples of Spielberg's camera work throughout his career. These techniques are a way to place the audience right in the environment, creating that sense of immersion and tension. Our introduction to our protagonist also establishes a trope that would go on to become a common archetype in many Spielberg films: the everyman. Our salesman, David Mann, embodies the working class of 1970s America in a perfect nutshell. He looks normal, acts normal, and works on the road to support his family back home. There's actually an interesting conversation that takes place in the first act over the phone between Mann and his wife. He phones to check in on her and the kids, only for her to remind him of their marital troubles. It's an interesting scene because the conversation bears no direct relevance to the story at hand. In fact, it's never really alluded to again in the film. It does, however, go a long way towards humanizing Mann's character. It means from that point on, you have something to root for in his survival. Otherwise, he's just a guy on the road that you couldn't care less about. Another Spielberg hallmark is his ability to create tension simply through imagery, something his best films all exhibit. It's fascinating, however, to see the formative stages of this skill on display here in Duel. For example, early on in the film, before the truck is even established, he allows the camera to linger for a little longer than usual on the truck. In isolation, you would be forgiven for not detecting any imminent threat. However, he uses the power of imagery to his advantage, such as giving the truck a dilapidated, dirty aesthetic to evoke feelings of disgust, along with constant glances by Mann into the rearview mirror. This creates intrigue and mystery, key ingredients when building tension. After numerous times being cut off by the truck, he pulls into a petrol station, with the truck following suit. As his car is being filled, the driver of the truck steps out, only showing his feet from under the vehicle. It's another masterful tension-building moment for the film as it maintains the mystery around the truck driver, drawing the audience in once again. They both resume their drive, and from this point is where the story officially kicks off and the battle between our protagonist and antagonist is well underway. The drama continually escalates as Mann puts his foot to the floor in an attempt to outrun his gaining pursuant. As the film progresses along, Mann becomes increasingly more paranoid by the truck driver's behavior. With the truck driver's appearance a mystery, the truck itself starts to take on a personality of its own. You start to anticipate what move the truck will make next, almost forgetting that there is of course a driver behind the wheel. You get the sense of an almost man versus machine dynamic as this film goes on. Man is eventually run off the road by the truck, crashing into a fence outside a diner. He enters the diner and sits down to eat, processing the recent events. As he sits there, you get a great shot of the truck through the window over Man's shoulder, a beautiful illustration of the concept of danger and the sort of looming presence it commands in our lives. He begins to suspect his fellow patrons at the diner, building the paranoia aspect of the film that goes hand in hand with creating tension. If that isn't enough, this is followed by a scene involving a broken down school bus that our protagonist attempts to help, only to be accused of being crazy for his fear of the truck. Adding to the paranoia, the truck comes along to successfully nudge the bus back onto the road. A gut punch for Man, as he's not only afraid of the trucker, but now has to contend with an evil genius of sorts, capable of manipulating others. It's a daunting prospect as we realize that the trucker is not just out to kill, but to strike fear as well. After a long, continuous tussle, the film ends with Man leading the driver off a cliff, jumping out of his car just before it goes over. The truck is destroyed in the crash, implying the driver's death but still refusing to show him. The film ends with as much mystery as when it started. There are so many classic Spielberg techniques on display throughout this film, including the likes of the zoom-in close-up shot, long takes, and drawing attention to objects via a mirror or through a window. But perhaps the most genius Spielbergian technique on display here, however, is concealment. This is another common trait of his, found in many of his films. It's so simple, yet so effective. Choosing to not reveal the truck driver was a masterstroke that adds just another layer of intrigue to an already engaging plot. Little more than a hand and boots are seen of the driver throughout the film. He understands better than most that what you don't show is almost always more frightening than what you do show. I mean, look no further than Jaws, E.T. and Jurassic Park, all famous for concealing their biggest draw cards for as long as possible. You can almost consider Duel to be ground zero for this less is more approach to building tension. In a DVD documentary, Spielberg states, "Fear of the unknown is perhaps the greatest fear of all, and Duel playing heavily to that fear. The effect of not seeing the driver makes the real antagonist of the film the truck itself." Simple, yet brilliant. Perhaps the most staggering part of this film is that when you step back from it and view it for what it is, you realize that any and all engagement the audience awards it is solely based on the masterful direction at hand. After all, the plot is as simple as it gets and characters are scant at best. Duel is almost a training ground for Spielberg's mastery, a chance to show off his full arsenal of film techniques as a means of substituting for character and plot. It's an absolute masterclass in building tension whilst working with very little. There were several instances while watching where I could see the Hitchcock influence on Spielberg's filmmaking, and sure enough, when I did a little digging afterwards, I found that he was indeed inspired by Alfred Hitchcock in making this film, particularly when it came to juggling the use of sound and silence to create tension. If there's one aspect of the film I didn't care for, it was the narration by our main character. It felt a little jarring for a couple reasons. One, I felt what he said didn't add to what I could already observe through body language and visuals. And two, the sound quality of the narration was off. It sounded like the words were being spoken in the film, instead of that extra clarity that narrations normally have to separate from the in-film dialogue.
Well, you never know. You just never know. You just go along figuring some things don't change ever, right?
A small nitpick, but worth mentioning as it confused me at times. It's absolutely astonishing to see a young director so in command of his craft. Spielberg would have been 24 years old at that time, but he exhibits the skill of a veteran filmmaker. Hindsight may be 20/20, but you can truly see the makings of a future master filmmaker when you watch this film. I thoroughly enjoyed this movie. It's an old school thriller that pulls out all the filmmaking stops to create tension in an otherwise simple story. But above all, it was such a pleasure to witness Spielberg's first film, with the benefit of knowing where his career goes from this point. I give Duel an 8 out of 10, and I strongly recommend it for anyone who hasn't seen it. So that concludes my first edition of Directed by Steven Spielberg, and what a great start to this journey it has been. Make sure to tune in for the next one, Spielberg's second feature film titled The Sugarland Express, starring Goldie Hawn. Until then, thank you for watching and we'll talk to you next time. Bye.